Hello, welcome to my class on full-range communication. My name is Dr. Almendares. I have a PhD in leadership and organizational change, and I specialize in leadership communication. This class is based on a textbook I'm writing called Full-Range Communication, soon to be published. This is just an overview of one of the sections of the book that teaches how to create rapport with your peers. The subtitle mentions mirror neurons. The stimulation of mirror neurons is theoretical and is based on current research on human understanding. I'll talk about mirror neurons later in the class. Let's start off by talking about communication. More specifically, about the communication cycle. If you've never heard of the communication cycle, this may clarify a few things about what communication is and is not. The cycle of communication begins with a source point. If you're beginning a conversation, that would be you. Source point intends to emanate a particle in some way across some space, whether that's real or virtual space. This particle is made up of information, whether it's verbal or nonverbal. The particle is emanated to something called the receipt point. This may be a person or a thing. The particle carries with it an intention. What is the base intention for source point to send a particle across a space to a receipt point? Well, it's duplication. For example, if you tell someone something, the something is the particle. You want that someone to understand what you said, and in order for an understanding to occur, receipt point must duplicate it in his or her mind. When the particle is received and understood, the person acknowledges it by some kind of signal, maybe a nod or an okay, or something to let source know that the particle was understood. Once the particle has been acknowledged, then the communication cycle is complete. In order for communication to occur, all the factors must be present. Source point, receipt point, the particle, the intention, duplication, and acknowledgement. When any one of these factors is missing, you have no communication. For example, if you tell someone something and the person doesn't acknowledge you, the person just looks at you without responding or giving an indication that you were heard, there was no communication for lack of acknowledgement. If you give one of your employees some instructions on carrying out some duty and then walk away without waiting for an acknowledgement, there was no communication for lack of intention. Whether you're talking to someone or trying to communicate with a subject, the communication cycle is the same. So what is full-range communication? Given that we now know the communication cycle, full-range communication involves the selection of different kinds of signals to emanate information particles. We have various ways to communicate them. In fact, verbal human communication has been considered the most advanced form of biological understanding between beings. If we can speak the same language, we can load our communication with as much meaning as we want, and it can be easily understood at receipt point. That is, given the same level of education and understanding. Given that, verbal communication is but a fraction of the signals available to humans. These other vehicles are rarely, if ever, used. Sublingual communication refers to the quality of an emanated particle. How was a signal sent? You've heard people say, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. The verbal signal, regardless of the meaning of the words or semantics, carried with it volume and vocal pace. The variation enhances the original verbalization sent to carry empathic signals, such as anger or sadness or happiness. Combine that with facial expressions, considered embodiments, and you enhance the communication that much more. Embodiments are what psychologists refer to as body language. The psychological schools of thought have approached body language with attempts to interpret what a person was communicating by sitting or standing a certain way. In the field of leadership, the signals are just another form of communication. Since communication is about duplication, the only way to communicate with body language is mimicry, the lowest form of communication. Full-range communication is an intense form of exchange that involves all three types of signals. It involves observation and empathic listening as well. But first, let's look at each individual signal that's at our disposal. Verbal communication can occur in a couple of ways. Written communication is a significant form in creating policies or communicating important data that must be preserved. Memos, notes, letters, or phone texts are examples of this. The spoken word in face-to-face exchanges is the most effective way of communicating. Face-to-face encounters present the opportunity to engage fully using the full communication spectrum. The phone gives us the ability to communicate verbal signals and some nonverbal signals. For example, voice inflection and vocal pace. These are nonverbal signals that are available by phone. Still, there are some limitations to verbal communication signals. For example, the written word may be great for business exchanges in the form of memoranda, letters, and policies, but if you're communicating something personal, the written word has no emotional content or inflections. It's just data. Of course, with any verbal communication, you must speak the same language. And if you're sending an email or snail mail, there is the time factor. It may be a while before an email is read or snail mail arrives. Verbal communication over the phone also has its limitations. You can hear the voice and understand the language, and you can also hear inflections, volume, and vocal pace to help you understand the communication better. Still, there are no embodiments for you to observe. The spoken word carries with it sub-messages and other things besides the meaning of the words. For example, the volume of the voice can say a lot about the person's emotional state. If it's loud, it may be anger, frustration, or desperation. If it's low volume, the message may carry various other emotional states depending on the situation. Vocal communication can also be colored by the intensity of the voice. For example, tonality, such as speaking at distinct pitches, can also communicate excitement or fear. The way a word is said using strategically placed syllables is an example of inflection. If someone wants to emphasize something, inflection is what they will use. An important sublingual mode of communication is vocal pace. Vocal pace is what is known in communication studies as the rate of speech, or ROS. Vocal pace is a tendency that varies with learning styles. VAK stands for visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. These factors describe the way people fluctuate their ROS, or rate of speech. People who are visual tend to speak very rapidly. They want to get as much out as possible in a short time. Those who are auditory are more focused on the sounds words make, so they try to pronounce their words perfectly. The kinesthetic person speaks at a markedly slower pace. These people have a tendency to pause between words, as if trying to get the feel for the word. If a visual person converses with a kinesthetic person, chances are that they will not communicate very well. The visual person would be thinking, "Hurry up, get to the point," while the kinesthetic person would think, "Slow it down, buddy. I can't understand what you're saying." It's a type of break in communication. Have you ever watched someone take a spill on a bike or a skateboard and you cringe, almost feeling the pain yourself? Empathic signals are emanated between people all the time, especially during critical moments. These signals are also important communication tools as they carry emotional content as well. Another mode of communication has to do with our bodies. Embodiments refer to signals we exchange using our bodies. Body language is a field of study in psychological schools aimed at understanding the meaning of various body positions. But in the field of communication, embodiments are approached in a different manner. Knowing what is said with the body is not as significant as knowing how to communicate with the body signals, whether the person is seated, standing, or laying. Regardless of what messages are being transmitted, the ability to communicate with any signals is a more rewarding experience. Again, the way arms and legs are positioned or shifted are also food for psychological investigation regarding their meaning. However, in embodiment communication studies, we are more concerned with the observation of limb movements or positions with which to communicate. So whether the person is crossing his arms or using gestures to get verbal messages across, we're not concerned whether the person is lying or telling the truth. We're more concerned with communicating with the signals. They say the eyes are the windows of the soul, and a glance can speak 1,000 words. The meaning of a glance or a gaze is not a communication concern when it comes to embodiment communication. In communication studies, eye tendencies are more significant than the meaning. Tendencies such as a person that looks in your eyes or occasionally looks away are the signals that can be used to enhance communication. Communication occurs at various levels, including the cerebral neuron level. The mirror neuron theory came about when scientists were studying brain activity in macaque monkeys. You see, in order to detect neuron activity in a living brain, it's necessary to remove the scalp, which is why it's never been done with humans. Now, I'm not condoning the methods used for this study. Nevertheless, the discovery was significant. During the experiment, one monkey observed another monkey in the act of physically using his body to retrieve something. Both monkeys were wired for neuron firing detection. Certain specific neurons fired in the monkey executing the action, while the same neurons fired in the monkey that was simply observing it. What was found was that the end phenomenon of communication, duplication, was the basis for understanding at the physiological level. Our brains are wired to duplicate actions in order to understand them. Since the end phenomenon of all communication is duplication, then the only effective way to communicate at the physiological level is by direct duplication. What this means is that in order to communicate using your body, regardless of what you're saying or what they're saying, mirroring body positions is an act of communication hitting at the end phenomenon. Regardless of whether the person is seated, leaning, slouching, or standing, communicating effectively at this level requires duplication. Embodiments such as arm and leg movements also enhances the communication using duplication. When you have a conversation with someone, are they looking directly in your eyes or your lips? Or do they look away from time to time? Although psychological schools seek meaning in eye movement, communication studies are more concerned with communicating with these tendencies. If a person has a tendency to look away from time to time and you gaze directly into their eyes while they're talking, they'll likely feel uncomfortable. A couple of phonetics professors out of the University of Amsterdam devised a software called PROP, used for analyzing vocal signals. I used the software for my dissertation to calculate the rate of speech during communication exchanges. Other communication scientists have used words per second, but I found it more accurate to measure syllables per second. The software made the calculations much easier using recorded conversations. If you'd like to read my full dissertation about homophily and mirroring, it's available to read online free. Just do a Google Scholar search for Almendares and homophily. That's HOMOPHILY. Anyway, what I found was that visual people who spoke very rapidly produced about 4.1 to 4.8 syllables per second. The preciseness of the calculations were necessary to ensure that I was matching or mirroring the rate of speech properly. Auditory people, who were more concerned with the sounds words make, spoke at about 3.2 to 3.8 syllables per second. kinesthetic people who spoke a lot slower were at about 2.0 to 2.8 syllables. When we have conversations, we usually don't pay too much attention to vocal pace. We're more concerned with the content of the messages. Enhancing your communication by matching vocal pace creates a bond of commonality with the one with whom you're talking. This is the bond most associated with rapport. As we said before, communication is about duplication. When you send a signal out, you want the person receiving the signal to be able to duplicate it in their mind. Remember the communication cycle? Source point emanates a particle across a space with the intention of creating duplication at the receipt point. When the particle is understood and duplicated, then the person with whom you are talking has duplicated it in their mind. This is true of any communication, whether it be verbal, nonverbal, or embodiments. Duplication continues to be the end phenomenon in embodiment. When a person crosses his or her legs, and if you're able to, you wait a few seconds and you do the same thing with the opposite leg if you're facing each other. If you're side by side, it's the same leg. Anyway, the point is to create a mirror image of the person across you as you are exchanging verbal and nonverbal communication. Nonverbal signals such as the rate of speech can also be duplicated for more effective communication. Sounds like a lot to pay attention to when having a conversation, right? Well, we're barely scratching the surface when it comes to our brain's capacity to store, analyze, conclude, and act in a millisecond. The truth is, we limit ourselves by believing that we are unable. Communicating at a much higher level gives us relational power, but that's for another class. Full-range communication, then, is the ability to communicate at every level. It requires listening at a higher level, often referred to as empathic listening. This means that you not only listen to the words and the messages they contain, you observe body position, hand and leg movements, eye movements, and vocal pace. But full-range communication requires face-to-face encounters. Technological advances have helped some with real-time video conversations. Still, the image is often just the face. When you're sitting across someone, you see more of the body, such as arm and leg movement. Since the intention of communication is duplication, then all three modalities, verbal, nonverbal, and embodiments, should be involved with duplicating. When a salesman is trying to sell his wares, he or she will often repeat the question a potential customer says to answer it. Sales trainers found that customers feel as if the salesperson listens more effectively. It's just another form of duplication. Using all three modalities requires a lot of observation or empathic listening. Are they sitting? Are they slouching a bit? Are the arms at a rested position or moving around when talking? Do they look at you directly in your eyes, or do they look away from time to time? How are they speaking? Do they speak very rapidly? Do they slow down a little and pay attention to pronunciation? Or do they speak very slowly, pausing between words as if to feel them? Regardless of your field, full-range communication enhances your relationships, creating strong bonds. In my field, full-range communication makes change management more effective, maintaining morale and unity in organizations. Full-range communication requires practice. Empathic listening is a fascinating ability. Observing people during a conversation will help you understand how mirroring develops between people and how people shift body positions as they talk. Your first assignment is to visit a local coffee shop and observe people having conversations. Be sure to take something to take notes with. Write an analysis of what you saw. Were the people communicating visually, auditorily, or kinesthetically? How often did embodiment mirroring occur? Did they have the same eye tendencies? What was the tone of the conversation? Was it a positive one or negative? Once you've finished your observations and analysis, it's time to practice your abilities. Assignment 2 requires you to have a face-to-face conversation with someone you don't know. Someone you know would also know your tendencies and your background. We want to take note of the outcomes from the conversation, such as whether a bond was created. Your job is to mirror embodiments. Remember, don't immediately mimic the other person's movement. Instead, wait a few seconds before making the same motion. Also, remember that when you're looking in a mirror, the image is reversed. So when the person rests his right hand on the table, you wait a few seconds and you place your left hand on the table. If the person looks you straight in your eyes, don't turn away to look elsewhere. If the person looks away from time to time when they're talking, you do the same when you're talking. As you're conversing, you are also noting the rate of speech. Are they talking rapidly? Are they pronouncing their words precisely? Or are they talking very slowly and pausing between words or phrases? Whatever their modality, you match their vocal pace when you're talking. Continue practicing observation, mirroring embodiments, and matching rate of speech. To understand how well these tactics work, it may be necessary to experiment a little. Have a conversation with someone you don't know and begin mismirroring embodiments and mismatching rate of speech. Take note of any difference you may have noticed. Remember the communication cycle and its components so that you have a full working definition of communication. Verbal signals include the written words such as memos, texts, emails, etc., and also the spoken words such as face-to-face or telephone. Communicating with verbal signals is what we've grown accustomed to doing. The use of non-verbal signals, however, is not something that we pay much attention to when we have a conversation. If a person speaks very rapidly or slowly, we don't consciously adjust our vocal pace to match the other person. Full-range communication includes consciously mirroring another person's embodiments, such as body position and limb movements, and matching nonverbal signals like vocal pace. Mastering these tactics, combined with empathic and contextual listening, creates relational power, the power to influence the thoughts and actions of others.